Good morning. I'm going to talk about Calgary, a little bit about St. Louis and Washington, D.C., where I spent the last 10 years. But the message from Calgary is that help. And I mean help, and we're going to get into that. So today we're going to talk about current environment, challenges, regulation, and ideas. Current environment. So I'm going to show you Calgary's growth in 10-year increments starting in 1951. On the left, the olive pukey green are single-family housing developments. The blue are multi-unit developments. On the right is water lines. Calgary is a very large city area-wise. It's like huge. And so let's watch it. 51, 61, 71, 81, 91, 2000, 2011. It's grown exponentially, but it's largely a suburban type environment. And the condo market has just got started in the last 10 years. The rental market is starting to come back. I'm just seeing some folks over here doing 200 units in the south end near a new hospital. Interesting in Calgary is we got a land. The blue line shows you the land we're doing the master plans for to open up new development. The green line is what we serviced. The red line is land that's zoned. And what's happening in Calgary is there's a very widening gap between what we can afford to service and what we're planning to build on. In fact, the middle blue line is our debt ceiling limit is set by the government of Alberta, and we're almost there. One thing you need to know about Calgary is we don't charge you as much to develop as you do in other cities. It's really low. Now, the gentleman over here building 200 units may not agree with me, but it's really low. In fact, when we build new subdivisions and things like that, we upfront 100% of the cost of bringing the servicing to the land. You only pay back 50% of that. But what the debt ceiling limit is doing is it's making us realize we're slowing down the growth potentially on the edges, some people think. And it's really starting to drive a market in for infill in our established communities, which is apartments and condos. And just briefly, focus on the map of Calgary on the right. The two crosshatches are basically downtown. And when you look in all these purple dots, we've got land for 60,000 people in one blue, purple dot, 33 in another, 60,000 in another, and it goes on and on and on. But what's happening in Calgary is those purple dots are starting to slowly change into more multi-unit mixed in with other things, as I'll show. So our planned land supply is of just under 9,000 hectares. It's about 10% of the city. We've got about a 15-year supply. But if you go into the developed area of the city, under current zoning, we figure there's about 84,000 capacity in units under the existing rules. So there's a lot of market in Calgary, a lot of market that you can take advantage of. And one of the things we've been tracking over the last 5 years is the orange things. We issued 10,300 permits for new housing last year, but I'm showing you between multis and rows and singles and semis, the percentages between the two of them. So you see in 08, just before the crash in Calgary, which lasted about 36 minutes, there was a 40% split between singles and semis and 60 in multi and row. That's when they started to discover condos. And then it crashed as they got scared with what was happening, and it's now recovering. We're actually aiming for a 50-50 split between growth in the green fields and growth in the established areas in the next 40 years, and we're not getting there yet. But one of the messages we're selling to council is average tax yield per acre by property type, and this is Calgary. And I was very successful in the Washington, D.C. area in getting more high density in around metro stops by selling this to the council, because people are often afraid of, about multi-unit high-rise or mid-rise buildings. And I'm showing them the tax yield. At the bottom is farmland. At the top is downtown office high-rise mix. The next one's multi-family high-rise mix and multi-family high-rise. And I'm selling the message to council that we've got to do this, we've got to do it in the right places to get more of the green. Because more of the green results in higher tax revenues to help subsidize the growth that we've done on the edges of the city. So the world is starting to open up in Calgary, and it's becoming very friendly now to higher density. The other thing I'm selling them on is our tax base. And if you look at the assessed value for the city at $173 billion for residential, $61 billion for non-residential, but then you go over to the right and you see the taxes estimated this year and what the split is, just a little more skewed towards the commercial side. We're also selling the message that we need more high density to make that a better balance. So, challenges. Crank it up. We're going to go back and start that again.
Census Bureau. We sent you a census form, but you failed to return it to us.
My mail is piled up like crazy.
Yeah. Well, I just need to fill out this census form with you.
Great.
Okay. How many people live in this residence?
Oh boy, That's a good question. I'm bad with numbers. Maybe 80.
80 people live in this apartment?
Seems high, doesn't it? How about 4?
The guy breaks me up. But we do a census every year in Calgary, and we grew by over 30,000 people last year. The city is growing exponentially. And it's the youngest city in the country of any major metropolitan area. So the potential for rental is off the charts, because most of these people don't have enough money for a down payment for a house in Calgary, and the average price of a house in Calgary right now is just over $400,000. So regulation. Planet Calgary for Dummies. What you're looking at here is one of the major thoroughfares that go from the northwest end of the city, which is where most of the growth has occurred because it's got mountain views. It's about a 35, 45-minute drive to the Rockies. And we dropped the light rail line right up the middle of that road, and all of a sudden, the condos are popping up and the rentals are starting to come in. We just opened up a new LRT line to the west end of the city that cost over $1 billion, and we just recently opened up a new LRT line that goes to the northeast corner of the city, which is already starting to have benefits. So we are investing in infrastructure to help markets like you develop and succeed. Oh, and I should say, the two big things in Calgary are the Municipal Development Plan and the Calgary Transportation Plan. One is land use, the other is about the next capital infrastructure in transit, and we link them. We purposely did it to try and get this kind of development. So when you look at the transit map of Calgary, the yellow line down the middle are the new LRT line we're looking to do, and we're now investigating. The folks over here who are just building the 200 units are down in the bottom right-hand corner and hoping that light rail line will go in. The blue line is all new. Just opened both lines in the last year. So heavy investment in light rail. So ideas. One of the things we're doing to encourage more residential is in the downtown area this month we're introducing new zoning, where we're going to say you can build a building so high, but to get that, you've got to do certain things. So one of the things we're trying to do is encourage new residential development. And in fact, in some cases, we may actually look at property tax incentives, which is something I did every day in the States, but not in Canada, property tax incentives to get more rental housing. Building code challenges. I am plagued by this picture. Somebody built a 4-story stick-built building in Calgary a few years ago. It wasn't finished and it caught fire. And everybody thinks wood is unsafe. We have all these nice roads in Calgary that are so underdeveloped it's just insane. But we can't build over 4 stories of stick. Now in Washington, D.C., all along the Metro line, we're doing 1-story concrete, 5 a stick. In BC, you can do 6 a stick, I believe. And I read in the National Post yesterday that CMHC is looking at trying to encourage the building code nationally to allow 6-story built. They're doing 9 in England. And so one of the things we're working in Alberta is to try and boost the stick built to 6 stories, to open up more markets and lower the costs. We get this. More than a tad bland, and there's a real desire for larger units with more bedrooms. And there's stuff like this going up all over the city. Now, if we could get 2 more floors, maybe we could get better buildings. Higher density suburbs. This is just starting way north of the airport, near the new subway or LRT line. And you see your traditional cul-de-sac, which is a lot of the growth in Calgary in the edges. But we're starting to get the first experience with stick-built construction like the gentleman over here doing at the other end of the city. And the first guys in were these guys, and lo and behold, they all sold. So there is tremendous potential all over the city for this kind of stuff. So what we built in the last 5 years was just under 26,000 units, so 59% were singles and semis, 41% were multis. We see that growing in the next 5 years. In fact, these projections may be a little low. So the wrap up. I'm going to be living in a Volvo under a bridge in a month because I bought a condo that won't be finished until the fall. The builder is here today, and I cannot find rental accommodation. My landlord will not renew my lease for 6 months, and I can't not find a place to live. Last week, I was at a house renting for $2,700 a month, and there were 35 people waiting to get in the door to see it. The rental market in Calgary is unbelievable. I've never seen anything like it. And if you have a dog, it's really bad. It's the most pet-unfriendly place on the planet. So if you go on to rentfaster.ca and put in Calgary, and you'll see what the market's like. Every place you see has lineups out the door. And it wasn't like that last year. And it's getting worse. So, this is the northeast side of Calgary. Traditionally, the place you don't want to live, some people think. I happen to love it. But like most cities, you see large industrial areas, car parking lots, car sale dealerships, etc. Well, the circles represent where the new LRT opened up last fall. And already, some of the car dealerships are saying, okay, it's time to do something different. And they're looking to redevelop their property, seniors housing, rental housing, etc. The market is there. And the market is also there. Who's been to IKEA and seen you can live in 375 square feet? Well, when I was in Washington on the edge on the Red Line subway, I had a guy who was doing 275 units at 425 square feet. And now there's a guy in Calgary who wants to do it at 375. And he wants to put in 100 and some units, all small, all looking like this. He'll just go to IKEA and say, can I have 375 of everything, please? And he knows he will make a lot of money. So, this potential does exist. That has absolutely nothing to do with what I was talking about. I just happen to have one of those motorcycles. Actually, it does. That's what Calgary is. We are trying to supersize what we've already built. And if you come to Calgary, you'll find it's less expensive to build. There is no Ontario Municipal Board. So you get approved much faster. Remember, this is the Wild West. And in reality, this is what we're looking forward to. Come to Calgary, build some rental housing. Thank you.
So our next speaker is Eleanor McAteer from the City of Toronto. And I really have to thank Eleanor. She called me about a year ago, said, why don't you come in and chat with us? We need to get people to start building apartments in Toronto. What can we do to get this thing going? So it was sort of her thought that got us thinking together about, maybe just holding a public seminar and drilling down deep on this topic of building apartments. So please welcome Eleanor McAteer from the City of Toronto.
So great to see everyone here today, and Rollin, a very tough act to follow, but going on by what Derek said, I'm in the Tower Renewal Office at the City of Toronto. And so I'm really focused on the existing apartment buildings in the city. And we have lots of them in the city. We have more of them than just about anywhere else. So we've been looking over the last few years about the real opportunities around these apartment buildings and what great buildings they are and what important asset they are to the city and how we need to have these buildings in really great shape going forward. We have about 1,200 buildings, 1,200 sites in the city. About 500,000 people live there, but they've got some really neat characteristics. One is when they were built, there was absolutely no regard for energy efficiency, so they really use way, way too much energy, and that can all be fixed. The technology exists, and that's something that we're looking forward to doing more and more of. But one of the kind of neat aspects of the buildings is there was a planning concept at the time, sort of well known as Tower in the Park. And these buildings have lots of space around them. They were built all over the city. And this is a kind of, what you see here is kind of that typical layout. When you see apartments, you usually see more than one of them, and you see lots of space around them. And in the city, this is kind of the map of Toronto, and all those little black dots that you see are the 1,200 apartment buildings. So what's another neat feature is that they are located everywhere in the city. You can't go anywhere for very long and not find an apartment building. So when we look at the apartment buildings, we're really looking at the people who live there and how to make these really great places to live into the future. We know that there's opportunity to bring social change, social improvements to the buildings, as well as all of those environmental improvements for using less energy, for instance. And the great thing about all of this work is that it creates a lot of jobs, because bringing the buildings up to a future standard, if I can put it that way, really will require a lot of work at the buildings. But we'll get tremendous outcomes from it, because there'll be much more robust and better buildings for the decades to come. So this is really where we want to improve these living conditions. And this is important for thinking about how to use this open space around the buildings. So one of the things we know of is that people there and people in the neighborhoods would like these to be more vital areas. So we've looked at the land use provisions around the buildings and have come up with a 3-tiered approach. And this went through our council committees last year, and it was endorsed, this 3-tiered approach. The first tier is what we call RAC zoning, and this is residential apartment commercial zone. And it's a brand new zone category, and it went through council. It was passed last month. And basically the precondition was that the zoning was that nothing else could happen on these apartment sites other than the residential that you see there. There's no base permission to do anything else. So the RAC zoning is our first step in animating these buildings, so it allows for a broader range of uses on the site. So you sort of have this kind of sterile environment now, and what we envision in the future is much more dynamic kinds of uses. And this is important when we look at creating new investment and new infill on the sites potentially, because I think it draws interest and demand into the areas. Oops, went too far. There we go. And so when we really started to look at the potential for infill on the sites, we thought, you know, it's very hard to kind of look at 1,200 sites simultaneously and look at what the potential might be. So what we thought to do was look at a 10-year period from 1999 to 2009 and think and find out what has happened on these sites. And we didn't know what we would find when we started looking, but we were quite intrigued to find that there's actually been quite a lot happen on these sites. We found 34 infill applications, rezoning applications, that had been approved. So these had already gone through the process. And on a number of the sites, construction had already taken place. So there was 10,000 new units approved on existing apartment sites. And as Rollin mentioned, you know, there's a real impact when we look at transit investment. And certainly that's something that we all know that the city has every intention here in Toronto of doing. And the tunnel boring machines are hard at work in many places. And so this is underway, and we see that there's going to be more transit and more opportunities for growth and infill development around these transit investments. So when we look at this and we see that there is these 34 dots are really spread out through the city, just as the apartments are spread out through the city. And one of the other things we found is that there's a certain sense that there's lots of development, lots of activity going on downtown in Toronto, but nothing really happening outside of the downtown area. But actually, there is quite a lot going on, and in particular on infill sites, on apartment sites. Most of the actual unit count is outside of the downtown core where the new development is going. One of the things that we also found out about the infill characteristics, which is particularly interesting to us and why we started talking to Derek, because we saw real opportunity and that the market seemed to be identifying this opportunity to actually build new rental. Because of the 10,000 units, 2,600 of them were rental units, which is a very high proportion considering what we know about the history of rental infill. So about 800 of those units did have subsidies for affordable housing. 800 of them have been constructed without any subsidy. So this is really pointing to us that there's a real market potential here. And what we found in talking with people is that people who are in the rental business, those that own these apartment sites, like the rental business. It's a very good business for them, and they'd like to expand in that business and build more rental. And so there's been actually about 65 rental infill applications. There's been a lot made in the last few years. It seems to be really growing in interest. So I guess what this slide shows is that there's been a lot done. About 5% of the sites have an application or have rezoning. But the good news, I guess, for this group is that 95% of the sites are still there and still have that opportunity to be investigated. So thank you for being here, and I'm really interested to hear more about the potential for new apartments. Thank you.
Make sure the microphones are on. Okay, thanks very much, Eleanor. That was terrific, and those were two very, very good presentations. I'm going to be referring to a document here called the Rock Report. You should have got it when you registered. If you don't have it, Tiana, would you guys bring some in and put your hand up if you need this, okay? If you haven't got this when you registered, I want you to open up to the middle page, and I want you to look at a statistic here that we just find fascinating. And when we do feasibility studies, this is does everybody have one? Good, okay. If you open up to the center spread and go to go to the 8th column on that center spread, it says the units per 100 people, right? And so when someone says, is there demand for apartments, the very first thing we just go and calculate is just how many apartments are there per 100 people. If you scan down that line, you'll see that number really changes dramatically from city to city. So the city of Toronto has 10.17 apartments per 100 people. Everyone with me? Okay, if you go down a little further, then you can see the city of Toronto, the old city of Toronto, East York, have 16 apartments per 100 people. Sherbrooke has 23 apartments per 100 people. I just calculated Calgary's number. In Rollin, it's 3 apartments per 100 people. So you just compare, on a same-store basis, that the demand in Calgary is just screaming. But there are places where it's screaming even more in Ontario. Just go down to the second band of buildings, and in the Greater Toronto area, you can see places like Vaughan, King, and Richmond Hill, 0.35 apartments per 100 people. You see Markham, 0.53 apartments per 100 people. So these are vibrant, growing cities on the edge of the GTA that have virtually no new apartments. And you almost don't need a feasibility study to say, is there demand there? The demand is absolutely there. You do need to know what the rents are and the type of units to build, and we do those studies, but the demand is certainly there. Okay? So that's just the first thing you look at, a quick and dirty look to see how many apartments are relative to the number of people there. Now, I know that Markham is a bedroom town and not as many people rent and things like that, but it's off by a factor of 30, sometimes 60, compared to other areas. Now, if we just flip quickly to page 6 on this report, we ranked all the cities in Ontario as the best places to build and own. Now, this is a relative ranking, right? So, I mean, someone had to go at the bottom and we put Niagara Falls there. That doesn't mean that a bad deal in Markham is better than a good deal in Niagara Falls, right? This is a relative ranking. And we had to rank the city of Toronto as number 7 because but if you look at Yorkville, that would be number 1, right? There's just too many categories to break up. But we really ranked those areas north of Toronto, 1A and 1B, as just very, very attractive places to build because there was no supply whatsoever. If you go up there, there's just older, 3-story walk-ups and things like that, and you have a rapidly growing population, huge employment base, good transit, really, really terrific opportunities. We ranked the city of Ottawa as number 2, and we ranked that just for the stability of the Ottawa marketplace. A government town in a world that looks unshaky, looks pretty attractive as an apartment investment, and there has not been a lot of demand in Ottawa. Then we rank Burlington, Oakville, Milton, sort of west of Toronto, again, for their fast growth and the low number of apartment builds. But if you have time, this report and you're new to the apartment industry, this report is a good primer for the business. Okay, so we've got some microphones out there. If people have questions that they want to ask the panel, we're happy when you come up. I'll ask you, but I've got a couple of questions just to start with. Okay, so Eleanor, I think the first one to you is this is how our discussion started. This intensification of apartments in Toronto. And when we do feasibility studies and we study which deals pencil out the best, it's the intensified deal that works out the best, the tower in the park, right? So in the 60s and 70s, you built these buildings off to the side and there's land and there's extra parking, because when you build a new building there, your land is free. It can be your equity. There's often excess parking in the older building there. There's lots of buildings downtown Toronto where the parking lots the underground parking is half empty. And here's the key thing that people miss, is when you build the new building, your older building benefits. So you have 200 units there, now you have 400 units, right? So you got more money for your front gate. You can put amenities in your second building that the people in the first building can use, and you make your first building more valuable. Eleanor, how do you think we get people looking at this, and what's the city doing to help people who own these sites understand this opportunity better, and how are you helping them?
Well, I think, and we'll hear from Vince at lunchtime, but certainly it's something that a lot of the existing apartment building owners are becoming increasingly aware of, and mostly because they're looking at their neighbors who are investigating or actually undertaking these kinds of new investments and new developments. From the city side, I mentioned the three tiers of approach to having more and better infill. And we've done that first one, which is really kind of just animating the existing sites. But this bigger approach is really looking at how to make infill easier, how to communicate exactly what's needed to meet the city's requirements for approvals, guidance as to how to deal with putting infill into existing neighborhoods and the kinds of issues that may arise. So this is, we just finished that one task, so now we're on to this what we are calling Tier 3 approach.
Right. So I think you would agree that probably the easiest and the best opportunity to build apartments are for existing owners who have excess density on their site.
That's certainly been a big part of what the infill has been.
Okay, great. Let's talk about now, what it costs to build an apartment in your city and the soft costs associated with building an apartment building. Rollin?
Sure. If you build in the developed area in Calgary, we basically charge you a per linear meter frontage charge of $4,700 if you build in the established area downtown. Beyond that, if you're in the greenfield areas, you pay a lot levy, but it's not that significant. We may ask you to upgrade a couple of pipes in the infill area, but basically there's not a lot.
So per unit, how much would that work out to?
It's
for your
difficult
development charges?
Yeah, the development charges are very, very slight. Basically, that's it. If you're building on the avenues, not the streets, avenues run east-west, streets are north-south, we charge you $4,700 per linear meter. And if you're going over your excess density, we'll charge you $270 per square meter for your excess density. And that's pretty much it.
Okay. Eleanor, what are the charges in the city?
You know what, Derek? I'm not.
Seven.
It's certainly people find that to be a real element of what goes into the feasibility studies. We also have Section 37, which is another area that people are very concerned with in trying to find out the feasibility of a project. One of the changes in the official plan that's just coming through this year is about having the Section 37 benefits being applied to the existing site. So they don't necessarily have to be distributed into the neighborhood, but that can be actually applied on the existing site, which goes to your, what you had mentioned about the new building can improve the existing situation as well.
Okay. Now, Rollin, you've worked in the USA in municipal planning, and what creative things have you seen in the U.S. that maybe we could bring here?
Okay, in fact, we're having this discussion in Calgary and Alberta now. One of the biggest booms for us in St. Louis, where, incidentally, 500,000 people left the city in 45 years. So I did the first new apartment construction in 35 years when I was there. But what we did was we used tax credits to the nth degree. Historic tax credits were boom because we put 6,000 units in a small area downtown and 18th and 19th century shoe factories, which offset your cost by about 37%. And if you use federal historic tax credits, the building had to be rental for 5 years. So we produced a lot of rental housing using federal government subsidies in the form of tax credits. Low-income housing tax credits. We did a seniors project in a hospital that had been abandoned for 25 years. There were 17 different tax credit projects in that project. It's the only way we could make it work. In DC, it was different. Never waste a good foreclosure crisis. It's that clear. There are 4 million new renters in the United States due to the foreclosure crisis alone in 4 years. And as a result, the rental market was all that was being built. And Derek mentioned a good point about Ottawa. Well, when you're at the center of the free world, it doesn't stop. And so Washington is somewhat isolated, but all the new housing was in tax credits. And what we did was we also used TIFs, tax increment financing. You've heard of that. You can't do TIFs in Canada like you can in the United States. You can't capture retail sales taxes, gas taxes, excise taxes, utility taxes, etc. So we were using TIFs to do a lot of this stuff in Missouri. In Maryland, on the edge of DC, you can't do the retail taxes, but what we were doing, we were looking, I showed you that picture of the new light rail going up through all the areas. We were looking at doing value capture, where you actually put in the infrastructure and capture the increase in value and all the taxes I just mentioned on a quarter mile of each side of the new streetcar line. And you're generating all this revenue to create the infrastructure to create value for people like yourself who want to invest and build. We're starting to have that discussion in Calgary, and we're looking to the provincial government to try and give us that authority. It'll be a big fight. But the big difference, and the folks in Dallas and other places will know this, is how you have funding authority at the local level.
Eleanor?
And we too, at the City of Toronto, recognize that a lot of this is not within our level of government, that it is at a different level of government, and those kinds of requests have been made, and so efforts are underway, but it's a bit of a slog to get things in place.
Okay, so I'd like to ask a question about parking. When you're running a pro forma, it's costing today here on a high-rise to build a parking spot at $30,000 per unit, sometimes more if you go deeper. You're only renting that spot out for $100, $150 per month. It comes nowhere near breaking, even, right? So it becomes a drag on the entire pro forma. How much can the city do to minimize parking in transit-oriented buildings?
Well, I think, the new zoning provisions do try to recognize that there are alternative forms of transportation that we're definitely trying to promote. Things like bicycle parking, bicycle storage, that proximity to transit is taken into account. But on the existing sites, what we do know is there's a lot of excess parking. The provisions back 50 years ago were 1.25 spaces per unit, basically, way more than what the demand is. So what you have on the infill sites is already an excess supply of parking that could be applied to a new site.
Rollin?
Yeah. In St. Louis, there was no parking requirement. But nobody would build a building without parking. Why? Because the banks set the parking requirements. It's a little less in Canada, but in Washington and St. Louis, it was very difficult to get funding for a building if you didn't provide the amount of parking that the banks thought you needed. It was a real pain in the butt. The two oldest professions in the world both start with the letter P, and one of them is parking. Nobody ever gets that joke. And in Calgary, we're trying to get there. So one of the things that's just happened, and we'll be dealing with this in a couple of weeks, is somebody wants to build a 20-story automated parking garage on a laneway right into downtown to service the sites around it. What you'll find in cities like Toronto, where I worked for 20-some-odd years, and Calgary is a concerted effort to discourage parking in the downtown area. Somebody wants to do a centralized... Did you see the last Mission Impossible movie? Tom Cruise has the big fight in the automated stack, car goes in, it gets lifted up and put in a garage. That's what this guy wants to do. And there'll be a struggle about creating surplus parking. So we have a struggle with banks, and we have a struggle with our policies about how much parking is appropriate. One of the things we are doing, and I'm sure they're doing it in Toronto and other places, is car share, which is a great way to try and reduce your parking requirement. But another thing is, we were certainly doing this in Toronto years ago, was to encourage in some buildings a split between the commercial rental side of parking, say on the second and third floor, and the tenant parking in the below grade to try and get parking into the neighborhood.
Great. I thought that's just a very interesting thing you said. The city leaves you alone, and basically the lender determines how much parking you need to determine if your building is viable. How can we get that done here? That's a brilliantly simple idea.
Well, we were actually in Washington area, we were trying to get the major lenders into a room. And what we found is if we worked with local lenders as opposed to the bigger banks like Bank of America, et cetera, you had more success. And I also worked for an agency where we controlled $1 billion pension fund, and we invested in banks that were amenable. But calling the banks into a room and showing them what works in other places is a great way to try and change the dialogue.
Eleanor, what can we do in Toronto about that? Come in with the banker and say this is how much parking they've agreed to.
I'm not sure.
Yes. Okay, so I want to talk now about creating cities where people live. You talk about renters as being sort of, nearly wed and nearly dead kind of thing, right? And then there's the knowledge worker. How do we keep people in the city to keep our cities vibrant, in rental apartments?
Well, I think in Toronto we have 144 neighborhoods, and so we're really a big collection of a lot of different little cities and villages. And certainly downtown Toronto has tremendous building boom. 168 cranes, more than anywhere else in the world, are underway in Toronto. But there's a lot of niche areas that are exactly that. We have a lot of campuses. Someone was telling me yesterday there's 41 campuses in Toronto. Lots of academic activity bringing in people. And they're throughout the whole city. We have lots of areas of industrial and that kind of thought worker areas within the city and throughout the city. So I think looking at those niche areas is very important because there is a desire for people to be in proximity to where they work. Not everyone wants to live right downtown. Being not too far from downtown, but still not right downtown is still very desirable for a big segment of people.
Okay, great.
Where I worked in Maryland on the edge of Washington, D.C., I was everybody's worst nightmare. I was an immigrant and I was a renter. And people were terrified of me because immigrants and renters, they figured I was Hispanic, had 5 children, and I parked 5 1982 Impalas on their front lawn. And it was a hell of a thing to overcome, I'll tell you. But when the foreclosure crisis came and everybody was put out on the street, single moms with 3 kids, then we started to push that agenda. In Calgary, it's a little different. The estimate, and the mayor and I were talking about this in council on Monday, the estimate is that there's 30 to 50,000 illegal secondary suites in the city of Calgary. Illegal. That's the estimate. 30 to 50,000. And when and the city council in the past has had trouble coming to grips with that number and thinking about trying to free up the market. So what we're trying to do, I mentioned, is change the building code to get up to 6 floors. Getting the LRT investments into the right places, and getting some good examples of growth that will in turn show people how this can happen and how it can happen in a good way.
Okay, we have a question. Garnet?
Yes, thank you. My question's for Rollin. I was actually just going to ask about the secondary suites issue. I know that's been a major initiative of the mayor's is to open up the rules around that. Do you see that as changing the demand, or is that just a matter of legalizing what's already happening?
Well, 2 things will happen. One thing will happen is, I know I was looking at this in Toronto in '81. Most cities that legalize secondary suites, not a lot happens with respect to people coming out of the woodwork to have them legalized because they don't want us in their building. They don't want their property tax to go up. The key with secondary suites is to provide housing for people who need it. But at the same time, as Derek was mentioning, it's critical that we explore areas of the city where we can do other things and think about freeing up other things. Like I said, changing the building code, freeing up the approval process for rental housing and bumping it up to the top. And then if you're doing a green building, it's even better. And selling rental house, I should have mentioned this in the last question. One of the things we were doing in Maryland was selling rental housing as a greener form of development because the people who hold on to the property longer will realize the investment, whereas the condo owners don't. So what we're trying to do is just give people a lot of alternatives.
You know, it's interesting, we have this discussion on basement apartments a lot. You know, this is a world-class city, you know, in a world-class country, right? I don't think putting our citizens in basements is the answer. We need to build purpose-built rental apartments. That should be our main go-forward strategy.
And one of the big things in the city that's a really emerging issue is, and it relates to your conference yesterday, is student housing and unlicensed rooming houses, and the really horrible situation that a lot of people are living in and paying very substantial rents. I was told yesterday $700 a month for less than a room.
Yes.
And that's, our academic institutions are looking at expanding. We're looking at bringing in 20 to 30,000 more students over the next 5 years. And where are they going to live? And purpose-built rental would really be very helpful.
Yeah, you know, Toronto could easily take 20 or 30,000 units built. The vacancy rate might pop up 1 or 2%, and there'd be choice for renters, and I think it would just help everybody. So that's what we're about here today, is how do we get this started?
But Derek, if I can just add, you know, when you think of rental housing, and this was a real it's a challenge in Calgary, it was a challenge in Washington, and you know, I met with mayors of Atlanta, San Francisco, and other places. Their biggest challenge is getting workers. So I had employees in my last job in DC, they were living 3 to a unit because they couldn't afford to live there. And so when you look at the average commute times in Bethesda, Maryland to get to the hospital to work, it's 45 minutes in each direction. And those are, you know, not doctors. They're making $43,000 a year. And in San Francisco, one of the greatest challenges is getting people to live there because they can't get to work because they can't live close enough. And that will become a challenge in places like Calgary, where the cost of living gets so high and we're not creating enough what they call affordable units, but that's for police officers, teachers, government workers, etc.
Okay, great. Okay, so last question, if there's one more from the audience, we're happy to take that also. Do you have a preference for rental over condo? When someone comes in to see you and says, I want to build a condo versus a rental, do you care? And how's that application treated any differently?
I don't think that it is today. That's certainly something that we are looking at trying to put in very formal approaches, and that's that Tier 3 I was referring to,
Yes.
to try to improve that situation.
One of the great problems in government is, potential problems, is you can't discriminate on the basis of tenure. However, we do have some flexibility. So one of the things we're looking at in Calgary is if somebody comes in with rental housing in a mixed-use building, we're getting a lot of big box development downtown, we want the housing above, is to look at can we do something with property tax. In the States, I can tell you I would have given you property tax abatement for 5 to 10 years. I probably would have put in a development district to give you incentives to help it reinvest in infrastructure, maybe a TIF. In Calgary, potentially property tax breaks.
I mean, we've seen some incentives in London, Ontario, for example. If you build an apartment in the downtown core, then there's a phasing into the taxes. So in the first year, you pay 10% of the tax, second year, 20, 30, 40. And that takes the pressure off the developer in the first years where things are tight, you know, and you phase in the taxes. So things like that are helpful. Delaying development charges. If you've got to charge them, maybe you can delay them, put them at the back end as opposed to up front, and things like that. Okay, last question. What advice would you give any developer coming to the city, to your cities, to build apartments?
Well, I think certainly working with the city and trying to show that this is very important to the city. That Tier 3, why is this important? Why should the city give particular interest to this and priority to this? Right now, there's so much happening in the city. There's a lot. It's a very noisy environment. It's very hard to get people's attention and say, why is this important? But that's the kind of message that has to be brought. We certainly try to bring it internally, but there has to be that demand and that voice externally coming to the city through the political channels to say, this is something we want to do. This is going to be better for everyone. Let's get it done.
In Calgary, one of the challenges is diversity, and I don't mean ethnic. I mean diversity in who's building and who owns the land. Because what's happened in Calgary is 5 to 10 people have held all the land for a very long time. And they don't build, they get the land approved, and they sell it to somebody else to build. And that's been a challenge for the city. The good thing is that's starting to change. And one of the reasons I showed that aerial photograph with the new LRT and talked about the car lots and stuff is where we've put the transit recently is opening up new areas where that land is held by different people. And that diversity in who owns the land will make it more amenable for the development and easier for it to happen. Probably get in trouble for this. But there's a lot of potential given where the LRT, the light rail, has gone to east, northeast, for new people to come in and take advantage of opportunities where the traditional landholders in the city have not gone.